Welcome to World Report. I'm Jim Hansen. President Obama famously said that he's a better speechwriter than his speechwriters and knows more about policy than his policy directors. That was back in those golden days when he was flying high as the light bringer, the one who was going to make the oceans recede and the earth cool. Well, 6 years of dismal policy failures, both domestically and certainly on the world security stage, have disabused just about everybody of that notion. Except him. Now he thinks he's a better general than his generals. Well, they're not buying it, and there's been a growing revolt. It was led by General Martin Dempsey, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, during his testimony to the Senate.
If we reach the point where I believe our advisors should accompany Iraq troops on attacks against specific ISIL targets, I'll recommend that to the President. And if there are threats to the United States, then I, of course, would go back to the President and make a recommendation that may include the use of U.S. military ground forces.
He seems to have had enough of the fantasy, not war strategy that the President and his political tools dreamed up. The military is tasked with carrying out missions that the President determines are needed. The problem is they don't have magic powers, and if the mission isn't possible, they can't make it so. The President seems to think that he can will things into existence simply by saying the words. General Dempsey lays out a perfect example of this type of thinking when discussing the unicorn-like moderate Syrian rebels.
We will begin building a force of vetted, trained, moderate Syrians to take on ISIL in Syria. We will work to ensure that they have a Syrian chain of command and report to a moderate political authority.
So basically, if we can find 5 moderate rebels and pair them up with a couple of moderate politicians, all will be well. Nobody with a clue is holding their breath for that outcome. The President also has a deadly habit of telling our enemies what we will and won't do. When he was trying to fulfill his campaign promises early in his presidency, he announced a mini surge into Afghanistan, complete with an expiration date announcing when our troops would be leaving.
And as Commander-in-Chief, I have determined that it is in our vital national interest to send an additional 30,000 U.S. troops to Afghanistan. After 18 months, our troops will begin to come home.
Can you imagine FDR making a speech telling the world we're going to invade on D-Day, but all the troops are coming home before our next election? Most of Europe would be speaking German right now had he done so. Well, right now in Afghanistan, much of that country is falling back under the oppressive iron sandal of the Taliban. Now President Obama is telling ISIS they won't have to fight us.
But I want to be clear. The American forces that have been deployed to Iraq do not and will not have a combat mission.
That's excellent news for ISIS. Airstrikes are bad, but the 82nd Airborne is any Islamist's worst nightmare. General Mattis pointed that out in his testimony to Congress.
You just don't take anything off the table up front, which apparently the administration has tried to do, and I understand their reluctance to engage in yet another fight. I do understand that, but I think that the best military advice would never take some of our capability off the table. And if there's better military advice to be had, I would be eager to see it. But I think right now, up against this enemy, we're going to have to take our own side in this, and in that regard, it means we use all of our capabilities.
President Obama has always had a problem not listening to his military leaders. Well, now they're letting the public know about it. General Lloyd Austin, commander of CENTCOM, is tasked with carrying out these cunning plans, and he said Obama has rejected the best military advice. General Ray Odierno, the Army's chief of staff, says we're going to have ground forces to go in and root these guys out, and airstrikes are not the be-all and end-all solution. General Odierno would know. He was one of the main combat leaders on the ground in the fighting that won the last Iraq War. And why are we talking about the last Iraq War and the next one? Because President Obama, again against the advice of his military leaders, pulled all our troops out of Iraq, creating a vacuum that ISIS filled. General Mattis pointed that out during his congressional testimony as well.
The best military advice on Iraq and now on Afghanistan was that we leave some troops there in order to ensure we don't lose the successes we've achieved. The word we used before, I think on the record with the committee, was that the successes were reversible.
The voices of dissent are piling up, and the world is suffering from the hubris of our commander-in-chief, who is so used to being told he's the smartest guy in the room that he refuses to listen to men with a damn sight more experience than him fighting wars. Politicians and political tools win elections. Warriors win wars. Listen to the voices of experience, Mr. President, and put our national security ahead of your ego and failed policies. This is Jim Hansen, and that's World Report.